There's an expression in Turkish, dört yol, 4 ways, a crossroad. Crossroads are not tidy places. Historically, they were where strangers met, where languages mixed, and where prayer, trade, argument, and revelation shared the same ground. Along the medieval Silk Road, Jews, Sufis, nomads, pilgrims, physicians, and poets crossed paths in caravanserai, shrines, courts, and roadside inns. They debated, translated, borrowed, and listened, and sound, especially, traveled faster than doctrine. This podcast explores those historical crossings, because sometimes the divine is encountered in vibration before it is defined by religion. If you're curious about Silk Road history, mysticism, sacred sound, and the uneasy beauty of devotional traditions in proximity, meet me at this crossroad. I'm the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim. Sacred sound is my path, and this podcast is my caravanserai. Welcome. And we're back for the second episode of the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim podcast. Today's episode is the path and the place, Kabbalistic and Sufi concepts of spiritual journey, rupture, and return. On my journey as the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim, one of the central motifs has always been movement. This pattern began in childhood, and it has shaped how I relate to spiritual traditions. It's probably why I gravitate toward two spiritual systems that rely heavily on travel as an image of one's relationship with the divine. In this episode, we'll explore how Sufism and Kabbalah unpack the notion of journey and apply it, similarly and differently, to the human experience of divine relationship. But first, a bit more backstory on why movement has been such a potent spiritual technology for me, and why I cherish both Kabbalist and Sufi traditions for their journey wisdom. My parents moved regularly when I was a child for my father's job commitments. By the time I arrived at college, I had lived at 8 different addresses in 3 U.S. states. At the age of 18, I traveled all over Tibet with a group of students doing ethnographic survey work. At age 20, I flew alone to Nepal to work in a children's home and returned several more times during college breaks for a total of almost 8 months. A period of travel in the U.S. followed as I landed in marketing roles that required travel for my clients' exhibitions. My first husband was from Alaska, so we traveled there regularly as well for holidays and weddings. But none of that compared to the real movement that was yet to come. After a sudden and unexpected divorce in 2016, I divested myself of most of my worldly possessions and lived out of a carry-on suitcase for roughly a year, visiting 5 countries in Europe and traveling over 2/3 of the U.S. in my little Fiat 500, while pet sitting to put a roof over my head. Finally, in 2018, I realized that what I really wanted was not to travel more, but to settle abroad. A chance encounter with a friend who told me about the foreign employment system in the United Arab Emirates led me to sell my car, pack my suitcase again, and jump on a plane to Dubai with no plan and no plan B. As you might have guessed, it worked out. I spent 5 years in Dubai, built a beautiful life there, and then moved on, as I always do, traveling all over Turkey, Georgia, the Sinai Peninsula, and mainland Egypt as far south as Luxor. Finally, I settled in Cairo, and I hope will not move again anytime soon. I share all of this with you as background for this discussion of spiritual journeying, because while on the surface it might look like I undertook many of my travels for the sake of curiosity, self-expansion, or to check off a bucket list, I personally have always viewed it as being deeper. From that first trip to Tibet in 2002 until now, 2026, at the time of this recording, I have viewed all of my travel as a journey deeper into relationship with the divine, or as a process of discovering what the divine, or life, if you prefer, with a capital L, as a sentient collaborator, desires me to experience, participate in, or receive next. Perhaps this is an important place to start the discussion, with the most foundational qualities I feel every good spiritual traveler possesses: presence and receptivity. In fact, for many of us, travel is the only way we can reliably access these qualities on a regular basis. Environments we know all too well tend to lead us to the false assumption that we know how things go in that arena, and life does not always seem to invested in disabusing us of that notion. Whereas when we travel, we are constantly thrown into environments that are not like our own. We cannot predict what will happen, and every interaction demands a deeper attention to the moment, as well as a willingness to flow with, rather than against, what unfolds. It might not be surprising, then, that these are also important qualities for the spiritual journeyer. They are also qualities which, from my own practice, I have seen valued, taught, and embodied in both Kabbalistic and Sufi mystical traditions, albeit in different ways and with different kinds of wisdom, both of which I have come to value deeply in my path as a traveler on the Netivot Chokhmah, pathways of wisdom, or Allah Yolo, path of God, depending on which tradition one orients toward. Let's begin this discussion with the Sufi perspective, specifically the Anatolian form of Sufism now known as the Mevlevi tradition. If the term Mevlevi is unfamiliar to you, I point you to the famous poet Rumi, who is still widely read around the world today, even though he lived over 700 years ago in Konya, now in central Turkey, but then part of the lands known as Rum or Rome, a reference to the Byzantine territories that had recently come under Seljuk rule. Rumi's life and teachings form the basis for the Mevlevi tradition, and thousands of people around the world still call him Mevlana, a term of endearment and respect. His lineage also continues in various forms to this day. In Mevlevi Sufism, the term yol, path in Turkish, is a central construct. A person who is walking the way of Sufism has submitted themselves to a journey on Allah Yolu, the path of God. Some would say that yol is the natural condition of all human beings who are always walking toward God through the process and practice of remembrance. This world is full of opportunities to forget God, the Sufis tell us. Therefore, it is through practices such as sohbet, spiritual discourse, zikr, recitation of divine names, and in Mevlevi practice specifically, sema, the ceremony featuring whirling music and ilahis, that this remembrance takes hold of the human being and becomes an ongoing state. And it's worth noting that sema in the Mevlevi tradition comes from the Arabic root of the word that is in Hebrew shema, meaning to hear or to listen, or the command listen, as in Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel. So it's beautiful that the two traditions share the value of this term. One took it and created an embodied experience called Sema, and the other made Shema a core foundational concept of the tradition. Mevlevi teachings and music are full of references to Allah Yolu, and one might wonder why this motif became so central in this mystical tradition. On the one hand, we can say, well, Sufism is the inner dimension of Islam and therefore develops metaphors like this one to serve the practitioner's inner journey. On the other hand, we can say the Quran itself is full of references to the spiritual life as a form of traveling, albeit in Arabic rather than Turkish. Sirat, path, is one example, as is tariq, way, and sabil, which is path or way. The term tariq in particular is the root of tariqah, meaning a spiritual path or order, often understood as the inward or experiential component and complement to Sharia or Islamic law. There was one particular Quranic verse about journeying with God that I absolutely love and often use as a prayer in my own zikr with tasbih or prayer beads. We'll look at it a bit later in this episode and place it at the crossroads, Durt Yol, with a beautiful Jewish mystical text of similar sentiment. But classical Islamic texts and ideologies are not the only potential source for the romantic mystical nature of Mevlevi journey motifs. The era of Rumi in the 1200s was a time when Turkish and Turkic peoples still lived by traditional nomadic ideals. Mevlevi dervishes or adherents in the early centuries were often known to move from town to town, composing poetry and living through hospitality and patronage. Movement in this tradition was not, as we will later see with Jewish motifs, a product of rupture. Life on the road was natural, expected, and even beautiful. It was a legitimate way to order one's reality and did not inherently suggest a person was unstable or running from something. Figures who embody this movement in its formative early years, including Yunus Emre, a 13th century Anatolian poet who chose to write his passionate verses in Turkish, making them accessible to everyday people, rather than in Persian, which was more commonly used by erudite Sufis, but less accessible to the uninitiated. Personally, for me, Yunus Emre is my favorite poet, and the one who guides my daily practice on the ney, or Turkish flute. I am building a repertoire of his poetry, much of which has been set to simple melodies and turned into ilahis, ilahiler in Turkish, the plural, or spiritual hymns that are still sung across Turkey and around the world today. Many, if not most, of his poems make use of a journey motif. Sometimes the journey is toward God, and sometimes it's toward another place of spiritual meaning, such as the land of one's sheikh or spiritual guide, interpreting the process of gaining spiritual wisdom and insight through the lens of travel. Yunus Emre, while preeminent in this field, is just one of many poets of his era who traveled, wrote, and understood spirituality as an experience of the divine road, embodied through the human ritual of movement. And of course, there's Rumi himself. Born near Balkh, which was an important intellectual and spiritual center in what is now modern Afghanistan, Rumi's family fled the region ahead of the Mongol invasions and made their way westward to Anatolia. Talk about an epic journey, and one undertaken when Rumi was just a boy. Though the poet himself settled in Konya and remained there for much of his life, his poetry, most famously the 25,000-verse epic known as the Masnavi, which many Sufis regard as a kind of second Quran in a metaphorical sense, is filled with themes of longing, return, and love as movement. From Rumi's teachings emerged a form of Sufism in which disciples traveled, circulated poetry and music, and engaged in embodied practices where sound and movement functioned as forms of spiritual refinement and healing, restoring the participant again and again to the path and the destination, which is God. I first encountered Mevlevi Sufism in a deep way relatively late in my spiritual path in 2023, when I first went to Turkey, taking up the role of international pet sitter again on what would become my next significant phase of wandering after Dubai, one that ultimately brought me here to Egypt. I had been seeking a system that would apply the maqams, or musical modes that are common in this region, to spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical ailments. That highly niche and as yet unanswered request was met when I was in Turkey itself, where I first encountered the work of my dear Sheikh, Dr. Rahmi Oruç Güvenç, whose posthumous presence has been with me gently ever since. On that trip, I also traveled to Harran in the southeastern province of Urfa. This now Arab village on the border with Syria was once a prosperous upper Mesopotamian city and a home to prophet/patriarch Abraham and his wife Sarah before their own sacred migration down into Canaan. In Harran, I became friends with a local family and often helped them in the tourist gift shop they ran. Someone there taught me the phrase, Yolun açık olsun, may your way be open. I began wishing the tourists farewell in this manner whenever the buses would pull away, and they loved it. To me, this is the essence of the Sufi spiritual quest. May you, through remembrance of the divine, find that your way is always open to ever deeper levels of spiritual friendship and companionship, until one day you return forever into the bosom of the One. This is something I now wish not just for tourists at an old archaeological site, but for myself, my neighbors, and the entire world. In whatever form or by whatever name, the One, the divine unity, appears within your spiritual path, may your way be open for remembrance and return. Now let's turn to the other great desert spiritual tradition that centers heavily on the motif of journey, and that is Judaism. The inner dimension of Judaism, like Islam, has its own name and tradition. whereas in Islam it's called Sufism. In Judaism, this inner dimension is termed Kabbalah. This beautiful term simply means that which is received, which is itself a reference to one of the primary qualities of the spiritual traveler I mentioned earlier, the capacity to receive. Kabbalistic practice, as with many other Jewish practices, centers heavily on a core text, in this case, the Zohar, or Sefer HaZohar, a mystical commentary on the even more foundational Torah, which is, of course, the central text of Jewish tradition. Interestingly, one of the recurring motifs in the Zohar is that of travel. In the text, a band of rabbis known as the Chavraya, or the Fellowship, travel together throughout the land of Israel in the era following the destruction of the Second Temple, engaging in spiritual discourse with one another. In some ways, this practice mirrors the traveling bands of dervishes in Anatolia who, while not engaged in rabbinic discourse, did communicate with one another through shared poetry and music. In this case, the discourses of the Chavraya become part of the structure of the Zohar itself. We might even call them a literary motif. And by the way, I love the name Chavraya, in part because it's related to another term in Jewish tradition, chavruta, which is one's study partner, the person typically that one studies rabbinic texts with, and, becomes the person through which one's perspective is shaped in discourse. I also love the name Chavraya because it makes me think of the rabbis as a group traveling through Middle Earth, seeking to cast the One Ring back into the fire of Mordor. But I digress. From here, if we zoom out from this famous group of traveling mystical rabbis and move into the Torah itself, we find that the very first Jewish journeyer, if we could call him that within this frame of reference, was prophet or patriarch Abraham himself. A wanderer by design, much like the Turkic peoples from whom Rumi and his followers emerged, Abraham is described in Torah as journeying from the lower Mesopotamian city of Ur, in what is now Iraq, to the upper Mesopotamian city of Haran, in what is now Turkey. There he encounters divinity under the name El Shaddai and follows the directives of the One by this sacred name down into Canaan, where he lives in semi-nomadic, clan-based pattern for much of his life. Later, a famine in the land leads his descendants into Egypt in search of sustenance. From there, the theme of journeying continues into sharper focus, with perhaps much less romantic charm. For the Exodus is the point at which nomadism gives way to bondage, and journeys out of bondage or as a form of escape from inhospitable host cultures become the more dominant type of journey in Jewish narrative. For this reason, in wider Judaism, unlike in Sufism, the journey has been less an acceptable or celebrated lifestyle and more often an unavoidable response to rupture, frequently in the form of rejection by the dominant culture. Though perhaps emotionally heavier, this is another valuable facet of the spiritual journey motif. For how often are our deepest and most profound spiritual journeys initiated by some kind of dark night of the soul, as mythologist Joseph Campbell would call it? The Jewish journey that begins this cycle of journey through rupture is the Exodus from Egypt, which is itself a response to rupture, as the Israelites are freed from hundreds of years of forced labor. This is then followed by 40 years of wandering in the desert of what many believe to be the Sinai Peninsula. Last year I visited Mount Sinai itself, and if that is indeed the mountain where the famous Sinai covenant was given, what a beautifully desolate place it is through which to journey. A mystic and mythic landscape, if ever there was one. From there, the people wander, of course, into the wilderness until Moses dies, and then go on to enter Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, where, according to the text, they established themselves in the land. The themes set up in early Jewish experiences in Egypt and the settlement of the land, exile, wandering, dispersion, and return, themes which are mystically interpreted in the Zohar and throughout the tradition of Kabbalah, continue again and again throughout the people's story. The power dynamics can be troubling. Whereas Avraham was a wanderer in a nomadic era, his descendants moved toward establishing control and governance over territories he once traversed. What follows are periodic transfers of control from the Israelites to foreign powers, notably the Assyrians and Babylonians, who ultimately divest them of the land and send them into exile. Yet another forced journey. Later they return and then are exiled again under Roman rule, and after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, are dispersed across the world for many centuries until the formation of the modern state of Israel. Throughout that time, history shows us that Jews travel, sometimes by choice, but often by force, when, for whatever political or social reason, a host culture becomes inhospitable. These patterns show us a different understanding of the spiritual journey, one in which a fracture occurs within the harmony of creation, and the journey becomes a means both of surviving that fracture and finding one's way toward repair. It is perhaps this idea of the spiritual journey that has influenced me most heavily over the last 10 years, as my own period of adult international wandering was largely initiated by an unexpected divorce in 2016, as I mentioned earlier. The last 10 years have, in many ways, been a response to that rupture, seeking to heal it and also to journey my way into a different life, a process which is still unfolding. Kabbalah teaches the concept of tikkun, or repair, returning the world toward its original created order. In the Jewish story and in my own, movement has been a way of processing and undertaking that repair. This is one of many reasons I claim Judaism as my axis mundi among the desert traditions. In Jewish spirituality, then, we see what I like to call a, quote, diaspora consciousness, a way of understanding oneself as being abroad from the spiritual homeland, yet still deeply oriented toward it in spirit. For centuries, rabbis wrote and spoke about the land of Israel as a spiritual homeland toward which a diasporic people would turn and give honor, much as Muslims pray toward Mecca without expecting to live there. Only in the 18th and 19th centuries, as citizenship in modern nation-states became increasingly available to Jews, did the conversation begin to develop politically around a return to the homeland. The result of these conversations, a way of materializing the spiritual journey into a physical return, was and is Zionism. In this way, we can see that while not all journeying in Jewish spirituality is rupture-based, such as Abraham's call and journey, much of it over the last 2,000 years has indeed been shaped not by divine call, but by exigent circumstance, which, in some mystical traditions, is the divine call itself, albeit in an inconvenient, often even destructive form, allowing for the death of the old and the rebirth of the new. Now that we have a framework within which to explore both traditions, let's look at different facets of journey that appear in both Sufism and Kabbalah, each offering different ways of relating to God or the divine. In any journey, we have three core implied elements: the journey itself as the overarching construct, the movement between 2 points, and the destination. Each provides a different way of understanding the human-divine relationship. Interestingly, this is where we see a stark difference between the outer or religious journey of any tradition and its inner or mystical dimension. Outer or religious journeying tends to be linear in nature. God is a destination you reach after death, and life is a linear path, ideally toward higher and higher states of holiness, and therefore readiness to meet God. The movement along this journey is largely coded as conformity to religious law, internalization of sacred text, and right behavior in society. But on the mystical journey, we see a spiraling kind of movement that returns again and again, where God becomes both the destination and the journey itself. Heaven and hell are no longer future states, but levels of consciousness one is actively inhabiting now, as one longtime Sufi practitioner I know would put it. In Sufism, the mystical adherent is constantly with God as both journey and destination. In Kabbalah, the journeyer becomes aware of the emanations of the divine, the Sephirot, as they are commonly called, throughout creation. One may move nearer to or further from this awareness, but every movement of the human journey can return us to it again. This is what one might call a spiraling consciousness, and from my way of thinking, it's just one of the many ways that mysticism carries forward an older, more cyclical, and perhaps even feminine understanding of consciousness, even when the goddess herself is no longer explicitly named. So let's look at an example of this first from Jewish tradition. We'll turn to a text that is far older than the Zohar, although probably influenced it. Unless, of course, you subscribe to the theory that the Zohar, or at least its traditions, were preserved for centuries before being revealed publicly in the 13th century. That foundational older text is Sefer Yetzirah, a mystical treatise on the power of the Hebrew alphabet, composed sometime between the 3rd and 6th centuries, likely in the region of Mesopotamia or the Levant. The teachings are attributed to Avraham, or sometimes to Rabbi Akiva, though such attributions were a common literary practice that were used to lend a work authority and intellectual weight, and the actual authorship remains unknown. The work outlines 32 netivot chokhmah, or 32 paths of wisdom, consisting of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, each understood as a pathway of wisdom, and the 10 sephirot, which in this earlier text refer not to the later fully developed symbolic system of the Zohar, but more simply to numerical or enumerative principles, each comprising a path. One of the most famous of Sefer Yetzirah's spare cryptic verses reads as follows: Ve'im ratz libcha shuv lemakom. When your heart runs, return to the place. This cryptic little verse has been interpreted in various ways. Jewish meditation teachers often reference it as returning to the object of one's meditative focus when intrusive thoughts arise during practice. Others understand it as a return to the love of the divine when attention has been overtaken by worldly or material concerns. Still others see it, and I am one of them, as a beautiful journey teaching. When your heart spirals ever further away from the divine, as inevitably happens in life, even on the mystical path, return to the place. The divine is that place, the simultaneous origin and destination from which we are always coming and to which we are always returning. There's also a rabbinic understanding of hamakom, or the place, as a name for the divine. The logic is often expressed something like this: God is the container of the universe. Everything exists within God and within God's care. Therefore, God is the place. Practically, this appears in a number of ways. For example, in Jewish mourning, there is a custom to say Hamakom Yenachem Elchem, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem, may the place comfort you. Or in study, Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu, blessed be the place, blessed be he. Or in simple prayer, Hamakom Yerachem, the place have mercy on me. In Genesis 28:17, prophet Yaakov, or Jacob, declares over the ground where he has his vision, Ma norah hamakom hazeh, how awesome in this place, and then follows it with another declaration of place, Ein zeh kim im beit Elohim, v'zeh she'ar ha-shamayim. This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Imagining and relating to God as a place that has been deeply meaningful to me on my journeys and has brought comfort both in my own dark nights of the soul and in those moments when I felt most uncertain about how to move forward in unfamiliar places. I chanted this beautiful phrase often over the ground in Haran, Prophet Patriarch Abraham's once temporary home, and as an offering of honor and a kind of shamanic blessing. I also love the Ma Tovu prayer, a liturgical prayer recited by Jews, especially in Ashkenazi tradition, as they enter the synagogue or come to a time of prayer. It arises from the blessing of Balaam, a non-Jew, over the children of Israel from Numbers 24. The prayer exclaims over the beauty of the tents of Jacob and goes on in the extended liturgy to speak of Makom. In the traditional liturgical sequence, one of the verses reads, Adonai ahavti me'on baitecha u'makom mishkan kavodecha. O Lord, I love the dwelling of your house, the place where your glory resides. But actually, I love the feminized version by Rabbi Jill Hammer and Taya Masher, founders of the former Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, which reads, Shechina ahavit me'on baitech u'makom mishkan kavodech. O Shekhinah, the one who dwells, feminine eminence and immanent presence of the divine. I love the dwelling of your house and the place of the shrine of your presence. I hope for myself personally that I always dwell in the house of Shekhinah, the divine presence, and both love and return to her as the place. Now, let's take this beautiful teaching from Sefer Yetzirah and allow it to sit dort yolde, at the crossroads, with a verse from the Holy Quran, which is, of course, in Arabic, which reads, Rabbana alayka tawakkalna wa ilayka anabna wa ilayka al-masir. Quran 64. According to this Quranic verse, this prayer is spoken by Prophet or Patriarch Abraham and those who are with him. I smiled at this because, for my journey at least, Abraham and his family and household have been the ultimate teachers, whose Mesopotamian-rooted spiritual worldview transcends and precedes, in my opinion, the religious traditions, all of them, that later claim him. At face value, this prayer might sound more like a religious expression, reinforcing the conception of spirituality as a linear journey from birth to meeting God after death. But notice the phrase, wa ilaika anabna, we turn to you. This turning, like so many forms of turning in the desert traditions, involves repentance and surrender, as well as orientation. But seen through a mystical lens, this is perhaps not so much turning away from things I'm supposed to feel ashamed of, which I recognize as a more conventional religious framing, and more of, let me turn again and again to you on this spiraling journey, which will ultimately end in you as well. I find myself returning to this prayer again and again and setting it alongside the injunction to return to the place as found in Sefer Yetzirah. As any spiritual journeyer knows, one must put one's trust in the divine at the outset of the journey and at every moment along the way. This is the work of remembrance, as emphasized in Sufism, and of receiving, as found in Kabbalah. But one must also return to the place and turn toward the divine throughout the journey as well, even as one spirals ever onward toward the divine, as al-Masir, or ultimate destination. While al-Masir is not one of the traditionally enumerated 99 names of God in Islam, I find it to be a potent expression, a kind of companion to Hamakom, but oriented toward the ultimate sense rather than the ongoing. Which makes sense to me, as Judaism traditionally places less emphasis on the end of the world, or Olam Haba, the world to come, than does its counterpart, Islam. Yet both names are needed for a more complete picture of the divine as destination, in each moment and in the ultimate sense. And this perhaps brings us around to the wisdom of this episode's crossroads. Journey and destination are both constructs for divine relationship in Islamic Sufism and Jewish Kabbalah. Both traditions offer wisdom for one's movement, physically and spiritually, and both frame one's relationship with the divine as a kind of return. In both traditions, God is a path and a destination. But there is a fundamental difference in emphasis. Jewish, and therefore Kabbalistic tradition, emphasizes journeying as a response to rupture, an experience of growth and healing after rupture, and a way of living that is often characterized by moving just ahead of rejection. Whereas in Sufism, journeying is a natural characteristic of the human condition, a metaphor through which all humans can understand, order, and relate to their spiritual path, and a way of life not primarily initiated by rupture, but by the natural human urge to expand and grow through shifting landscapes. Through the Jewish experience of journeying, I have learned so much, and it's been the predominant lens for my prior journeys. Through significant periods of my life where rupture, such as my first divorce, for example, did precede long-term travel. I find that the wisdom of Sufism beckons to me now for this next phase, a way of relating to the journey not as something I'll eventually get out of, i.e. the Jewish notion that someday we return home to the land, but more as a home in its own right, i.e. the Sufi notion of being at home on the road and ever in motion. Which construct speaks to your soul? Which tradition is closer to your personal orientation? And how are these rich journey teachings helping you live out and embody your relationship with God? I invite you to consider these questions in the days ahead. At the time of this recording, Muslims have just re-entered ordinary time after a significant month-long sacred time, Ramadan, culminating in Eid al-Fitr, whereas Jews like myself are currently inside the 8 days, or 7 if you're in Israel, of sacred time for Passover. Perhaps the most iconic Jewish holiday of all, and one that commemorates the very first post-rupture journey of the Jewish people. If you're listening in time with this episode's release, or encountering it at another moment in sacred time, sacred history, or the unfolding of your own sacred journey, I wish you safety and Godspeed, or goddess speed, on Nedivot Chochmah and Allahin Yolu. Until next time, Yolan Achuk Olsen. May your way be open. I'm the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim, and I'll see you back here at Dort Yol, the crossroads, very soon. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of the Jewish Sufi Pilgrim. If you'd like to learn more about my work, you can visit lisaengland.com, that's England like the country, or explore the world of Turkish music therapy at turkishmusictherapy.substack.com. If you'd like to share a reflection or ask a question, you're welcome to write to me at Jewish Sufi Pilgrim at proton, proton.me. And if this episode resonated with you, please do consider sharing it with a fellow traveler on the path. Until next time, keep your voice warm, your instruments tuned, and I'll meet you again at this crossroad.